Hi everybody and welcome to our speaker series. My name is Lysele. Before we begin today, I would like to acknowledge the Gadigal Wongal people of the Eora Nation and pay my respects to the elders past, present and emerging. Today we have with us our local Greek author and historian Vasilios Vasilas, who will talk about his book Little Athens. So, Little Athens, what was the inspiration behind the book and why is it called Little Athens?
Little Athens was a title or a name that I used to hear in the 80s. Okay, so people used to associate Marrickville as being a Greek suburb, and Little Athens was one of the names. I could have opted for a more derogatory name or a more racist name, but we went for Little Athens.
Can you elaborate on the reasons why you published Little Athens and the relationship that you have with Marrickville?
Little Athens is not a new project. It is part of the Agora series where I look at Greek businesses and Greek shops across Sydney. And the focus is this diversity that the Greeks are into many businesses and many different types of businesses. I was looking at other businesses like the Greek barbers, the Greek hairdressers, the Greek tailors, the Greek cobblers, the Greek florists, the Greek mechanics. And so Marrickville came out of that idea where I was gradually getting stories from Marrickville, and it came to a point where I thought, is there a volume in Marrickville by itself? And so it got to that point where, I had, let's say, 15 or 20 stories, and I thought to myself, wow, there could be a volume here. And there is a volume, okay? And that is called Little Athens.
Can you tell us a little bit more about your creative process? That is how you developed Little Athens.
With Little Athens, it's all word of mouth. And the process, like all oral history that I've done several communities and several themes. Yes. The process is very, very different according to the project. With Little Athens, it started off with this Beyond the Shop Windows Encounters, but morphed into a Marrickville book. And a lot of it's word of mouth. Yes. So you start with one person and you ask them, can you please introduce me to someone else? And I always work like that because I think recommendations and introductions are vital. Okay, so Marrickville is a very, very close-knit community. And when you go to one shop owner and you say, well, who can you introduce me to? I'm sure they'll introduce you to somebody else.
So it's a very time-consuming process. How did you manage your time? Because I know you also teach.
I think everything is about planning and, having some kind of plan. So my writing always starts at 9:30 at night. So once the kids go to sleep, that is when I write. But in the meantime, I think, I'd have one interview per week. So a Saturday or a Sunday, I'll have the interview and then I'll transcribe the interview during the week after 9:30 during the week. But I think you're right, it's a very, very long process, but it's a very, very enjoyable process because the thing is, as an oral historian, you're picking up someone's story and then you are crafting it and then you're giving it back to them to edit it and they can see something being created. So it's a very, very exciting process. Long, but very, very exciting.
So you've talked about the businesses in Little Athens. What other themes are there in the book?
Marrickville, before the Greeks, settled here, was an industrial. People came to Marrickville because there was work. Yes, the shops were here. The long strip, the shopping strip on Marrickville Road and Illawarra Road are there. But the key drawing card for people to settle in Marrickville was work. So this massive industrial centre that Marrickville has was the drawing card for many Greeks that came here in the late 50s under the assisted passage program done by the government. It was a 20-year program. They came to Marrickville because there was work. Now, once you built a demographic, the shops came after. Because before the Greeks settled here on mass numbers, there was only a couple of milk bars and cafes. But after they settled, certain entrepreneurial Greeks were able to set up business here and create a network. So in other words, the Greeks that settled here had the luxury of having their butcher shop, of having their delis, of having their cobbler, their hairdresser, their barber. There's all this network of of businesses that they can visit. Because don't forget, they couldn't speak the language. So the language barrier is such a barrier. So they needed places to go where people could understand them, and also not understand their language, but also understand their culture and their mannerisms and their temperament. So a Greek visiting a Greek deli and then wanting certain bits, the person behind the counter would understand what they wanted. So that's a key theme, this sense of belonging in Marrickville. The other thing that comes up in the book is how hard working these businesses were. A lot of them dedicated so much time and so much effort. And you had stories of them, not going home, like the cake shop at Easter time, going 48 hours straight, or whatever, during, busy periods. So there's that strong work ethic that comes through all the stories. And, and what makes them special is this longevity. A lot of these businesses have been around now for over 30 years, 40 years. They're second generation business. Some are even third generation business. So Marrickville and the Greeks are still connected, even though the demographic has changed.
Yeah, it's changed. But do you think that there's more Greek businesses in Earlwood or Belmore?
Okay, that's a contentious issue. Thank you, Lysele. But I think with Earlwood, a lot of people moved from Marrickville to get to Earlwood, right? So I know my parents moved to Earlwood, in the early 70s, but my grandfather lived in Marrickville, right? So, a lot of the Earlwood Greeks, everyone came through Marrickville. If they didn't come through Marrickville, they came through the surrounding areas. So it's not just Marrickville, we're talking about, Dulwich Hill, we're talking about Helston Park, we're talking about, Stanmore, we're talking about Tempe, Sydenham. So, Marrickville, when we talk about Marrickville, we should also be talking about the surrounding areas. Because why it's important is, we settled in Earlwood, and I grew up in Earlwood, but my connection to Marrickville is very, very strong because my grandparents were here. Our parish is here, St. Nicholas. Okay, so we've always gone to St. Nicholas. I was part of the first crew at Marrickville McDonald's when I opened up in the mid-80s. So I worked in Marrickville during university. I worked during university holidays at the Australian Confectionery / the Nut Hut, which was on Edinburgh Road. It's no longer there. So Marrickville's always been part of my life, even socially, we'd go to concerts in the city or clubbing, and the ritual was to always pass through Marrickville and have a gyros before we went home. So that was the ritual. No matter where we were, Marrickville was the way home. Or the rotisserie, the Corinthian rotisserie, which other place was open at 2 o'clock in the morning, we could get a hearty meal. So you'd go out, and on the way home, you'd stop at one of these shops because they were still open. So Marrickville, even though, we're Earlwood, we're very, very close by. And I must say that, even though we settled in Earlwood, until, for example, Earlwood got its own Greek deli, we did all our deli shopping in Marrickville. So we still came to Marrickville. And I'm sure a lot of the Greeks in the surrounding areas would have done the same thing, because Marrickville draws people because they know they can get their Greek products. They know that it's there. So I suppose that's why Marrickville was so busy in the 80s and early 90s. Even though Greeks had moved out of the area or began moving out of the area, they still came to Marrickville because they knew they could get that service, they knew they could get that product.
So I believe there were two people that were very influential in your life. Can you tell us why?
Two people in my life. My mother, Nikki, is very, very important because she kept me straight and narrow, on the right path. She dedicated a lot of time for me to study. So my mum is very, very important in that way. But I think the aura of history is that I was living with history in the sense of my grandfather, my paternal grandfather. And his life was fascinating because his father, he never met his father because his father went to the United States to work, and then on the way back, the ship hit a mine in the port of Marseille during the war. It sunk, and he never saw his dad again. So he never grew up with his father. And then, a few years later, he was at the burning of Smyrna at the Greek-Turkish War of 1919 to 1922. So as a child, he was there, and he was lucky his stepfather had American citizenship. and they were able to get the family out before all the massacres and the burning and whatever. So then he experiences that, and then it's his generation that has to go to war. So then he finds himself in the Greek-Italian War in World War II. So he's got another story there. And then after the World War II, he was in the wrong place at the wrong time with the wrong politics, and so he gets caught up in the Greek Civil War, and at one point he's interned because of his political views, and then he finds himself migrating to the other side of the world. So you got this rich history in the one person, and I've been quoted, in other areas where I've said, he epitomizes the age of heroes, the ordinary hero. And that's what oral history is about. Oral history is about looking at people who never had a voice. And I suppose my grandfather, who, experienced so much history, he was like a walking history. So I remember when I was a child, he'd talk about things, but when you're 8 or 9 or 10 years old, you don't value the stories at the time. But I do clearly remember him talking about certain things, and I suppose that played a huge impression on me growing up.
So you were very close to your papu?
Well, yes. He was in Marrickville, and we lived with him, for a while when we were between houses. But he left in the early 80s with my grandmother. He was out here every 2 years visiting us, and every 2 years I'd say, oh look, I'll get his story, but we never got round to getting the story. So when he passed away, I suppose that really prompted me to go into other people's stories. That was probably the inspiration. The fact that I missed out on his story that I wanted so much, and then I found myself taking everyone else's stories.
So some people think that Melbourne is the capital of Greek culture in Australia. So why Marrickville?
Okay, the statistics show that, about half of Marrickville's population, half of Sydney's Greek population was centred around Marrickville and the surrounding areas. At one point, early 70s, late 60s, half of that population of Sydney was around Marrickville and the surrounding areas. So I think that's important to note. Now, I understand that Melbourne is arguably the third or fourth largest Greek city in the world. There's a contentious issue with Chicago, but we're not talking about Marrickville here. We're talking about Sydney. And I think, I must commend, the Inner West Council, for taking the initiative and naming a part of Marrickville and a part of Dalit Chill, Little Athens, because they're paying tribute to the legacy that's been left behind by this community. Just like Leichhardt, because the thing, if you think about it, the Greeks and the Italians were the first largest groups of post-World War II migrations that set up business centres in Leichhardt and Marrickville respectively. Sure, the demographics have changed, but I think the Inner West Council is looking at the legacy that they left behind, that this was the birth of multiculturalism. You look at the Greek Festival of Sydney, that's run by the Greek Orthodox community. Their first Greek festival was in Marrickville, right? So this is why it's so important, that even today, going back to the businesses that are still remaining, these Greek businesses, their longevity has meant that they've moved from being a Greek business to an Australian business. The Greeks have integrated successfully into the broader community, and when you talk about a Greek gyros or a Greek baklava or whatever, it's really about how these foods have become part of the Australian cuisine. And that's what you've got to understand about these businesses and these shops. Yes, they're Greek, but they are also Australian. They're part of the Australian cuisine now. So I think this is the Inner West Council's way of paying tribute to not only the legacy, the contribution and the presence in the area, but how it's developed and how it's evolved over a long period of time.
If you had to summarise the Greek presence in Marrickville, what would it be?
I believe that Marrickville shatters every stereotype of what the Greek contribution and Greek presence in Australia was, because it epitomises their efforts, their work ethic, and what they did. They got into all sorts of businesses, not only retail, but also industry. You know, like lots of Greeks moved into Marrickville's industry, and they are major players in the local, national, and even international markets. So Marrickville, I think, should be proud of that Greek contribution and the presence that it's had in the last, 40, 50 years. So in summation, that's what the Inner West Council is trying to do by acknowledging and paying respect to that Greek contribution and that Greek presence in the area.